Good afternoon and welcome to Topanga Fine Arts for our artist talk about this exhibition that we have up right now, Seeing the Unseen. Artist talk is going to be moderated by Farah Karapetian in conversation with Carolyn Barber, Ram Darnam Walker, Meg Madison, and Laura Parker. Welcome.
Thank you for having me. We'll wait for the return of our fourth.
Sorry about that. Laura's bleeding.
It's completely fine. This is
Off camera.
this is a conversation, right? So we don't have to feel like we're on a panel. This is a conversation. And we're in the company of the real interlocutors, which is the work. So that's, I think, what makes this so fun and so easy, right? How does the work speak for itself? We're in a room full of photographs, but they're all kinds of photographs that might be kind of not what everyone perceives as such. Is there something about the photograph that before we even get into the notion of what we can see and what we can't see, is there something about the photograph that is malleable in a way that you guys find, liberating? Whereas some people think of it as, incredibly fixed, as a thing that you do every day on your phone, or as something that is determined by a mechanism. Is there something about the photographic process that's been especially elastic for you and given you the playground you need to see, to unsee?
I think that at least for myself, I can say that the sort of fugitiveness of the process, which is sort of AKA making mistakes, has been sort of like the sort of unraveling of the whole of the whole kind of body photography, because we have this very exact, perfected notion of how crisp and clear a photograph is supposed to be, that comes back from the 40s and 30s, when people were making these like super crisp, hyper realistic black and white photographs, and to be able to use that as a basis for making mistakes or discovery, into the sort of curiosity of the photograph, I think has been, just an instrumental thing for myself.
Right, and the technology itself is developed along the lines of people wanting more and more precision, and so to resist that is, in effect, none of the work here is overtly political, but it's a political act to take apart a way of communicating, that's been kind of, directed from above in an invisible way. Does that make sense as a vocabulary for you?
Mm-hmm.
I think for me that I studied filmmaking in college, and I came later in life to photography, and there's people who I admire greatly, like Ken Gonzalez-Day, who's Robert Mapplethorpe, Cindy Sherman, whose work is not only technically perfect, the prints are technically perfect, and everything it's almost wholly this kind of dialogue and, around that. And I made black and white photographs at one time, and I've made color photographs, but my work now, where I make a cyanotype and I go to a natural body of water and I lay something on top of the paper and expose it to the sun and then develop it in the LA River or Pacific Ocean, it's a completely different type of making a work of a print.
And this is the first kind of photography. These were the original mouse traps, where they put they literally called it that, he would put these little mouse traps of photosensitive material in his garden, and his wife was like, he's got mouse traps all over the floor. But this was the original photograph. So why wouldn't that be not only as legitimate, but also like perfect? you know, it seems to work with some kind of a modified process in that way. So I wonder if you've all kind of defined value for yourself in that way.
Also, working in the darkroom, which I started doing at a really young age, was just nothing short of pure magic and
Right.
alchemy. And what I discovered when the digital came on board was the battle between the pretty limited parameters of working in a dark room, which in a way it seemed like the more limited the parameters, the more freedom to experiment and improvise, which was always my way of working in a color darkroom, was like pure improvisation. I never went in there knowing exactly what was going to come out or what I was going to do or why I was going to do it. Then with digital processes, it took me almost a decade to make this weird, like, mental transition to the too muchness of the parameters. It's like, well, you can do this, you can do that, you can, I just so loathed it until I got hooked on an iPhone.
Yes.
But you all work with an analog process, right? And so it is that kind of elasticity or improvisation, as she says, that is motivating some part of this practice, if not a foundational part of the practice, right? What would you describe? What part of the practice is most improvisational for you?
I think just the not knowing what I'm going to get as a result of this double exposure in the camera.
Right. So for people who don't know what that means, it's like you're making the exposure, and then
Right.
for the initial one, you must know what you're looking at.
Yes. Because it's medium format as opposed to the 35 millimeter, which is usually what students can use because it's a little more forgiving.
Yeah.
The difficulty with the medium format is it's encased in paper. So it's very challenging to just, work with. It's a struggle a little bit. And a lot of times there was a big lapse between the first set of exposures, which was usually a hardscape, some kind of human-made structure, something non-organic. And then to have to put it back in the dark and then get it, keep it in, place because there's tension there. So then running it through again, and sometimes there was a big time lapse between the first set of exposures.
Would you mark it? So for people who haven't shot with cameras, she's saying she's got this like medium format film is like a big old bullet.
Yeah.
And it comes out as wrapped in paper. So you, when you're done with the roll, you take it out, you lick it shut, and then would you write on it? This was at the gym, or?
Well, I didn't even lick it. I had to feed it back and
so you would go directly back into the camera.
Correct.
But you wouldn't necessarily go shoot it again.
not right away.
Okay. So I was just wondering if you had like a bag of film, you'd be like, I'll take this one.
Yeah, kind of.
Okay.
Because a lot of times too, projects that I would work on, they were highly controlled, where the lighting and everything was staged and everything was kind of pre-planned. So this was kind of a mental way to release
Right.
from that rigor.
Right.
And kind of just be like, I don't know what I'm gonna get, and I like that freedom. There's a little bit of the typology to kind of still guide me.
Mm-hmm.
You know, hardscape and then plus organic equals X.
Mhm.
So I kind of started the project because I moved downtown, and I just loved all those old structures, the bridges, this non-suburbia that I was dealing with.
Yeah.
So that kind of initiated.
So the improvisation really becomes that even though it is going directly back into the camera and there's the parameter of hard versus soft,
Yes.
you're actually not quite able to remember what was
Not at all.
image 1 through 12. And so the juxtapositions become really
Accidental and
Yeah.
you know, of course, on any, because then when you get the roll of medium format, it's 12 exposures
right.
as opposed to 36.
Right.
So sometimes from those 12, maybe half are like no-goes or more.
Yeah.
You might have 8 of them that are like thumbs down, they just didn't work.
Sometimes you're lucky if you have one.
Correct.
And then you said 35 millimeter film
Well,
from a long time ago?
yeah, from like the mid-'80s.
And you were taking it into the darkroom, circle cutout.
Well, I took, like, I went through my ancient negatives and
Yeah.
picked some ones that I thought were sort of evocative with movement and a certain blur or whatever. So I picked like 3 or 4 negatives, took them into the darkroom with a soup bowl
Yeah.
made out of porcelain and a Pyrex transparent pie plate. So basically, the red, like, circle that's kind of eclipse-like is the edge of the transparent pie plate. And then the soup bowl is the circle, which becomes, it's hard for people that don't know like darkroom printing, but it becomes the negative space that the image is projected inside of. So
Right, so in a darkroom, there's like, it's pretty simple.
Yeah.
There's light coming down onto a photosensitive thing. And usually when we're trying to replicate the world, we stick a negative in up there, light goes through it, and you try to get the whole thing to look like the real world. But you've made a lot of light hit where it's black.
Yeah.
You've blocked it with
Yeah.
the bowl.
right.
And so that's why it gets all black. But where the Pyrex plate's lip comes, that's letting in a little bit of light once you've removed that bowl to expose for the.
Exactly. And the reason behind it was that I was trying to investigate perception and optics and break it down into almost sort of cinematic things and question a little bit why a certain subject is important or more important than another. Like in the horse, it's like, yes, we all want to look at the horse, but does anybody want to look at the knee of the horse, or, you know, and how that's like culturally and culturally ingrained and perceptually ingrained. So I'm interested in optics and eye movement and sort of a science and psychology of photography.
But that improvisation comes in because of where you put the bowl.
Absolutely.
At the same time, you know those pictures to some extent. So like there is a little muscle memory about like, I think the horse's knees are here.
Absolutely.
Right?
I can't, I would never say it was
Yeah.
100%
Just as you kind of remember
Yeah.
what part of the building, but you're looking for that again when you put the pie bowl down, right?
That's true. That's very true.
Yeah, it seems like we're sort of involved in these processes where we're trying to guide something, you know,
Oh, yeah.
very, very conscientiously trying to make something happen,
Uh-huh.
and then something comes along and like goes,
Yeah.
that's not how it's going to happen. You know, we're
Correct.
taking this. It's like the technology takes that away from us and sort of goes on its own to make something else, or to make something we'd never even think of.
Yeah.
You know, which is the beauty of
Or imagine.
creation.
Right.
Predict.
Right, you have
Yeah.
to put yourself in the position of being open to something that will happen that you didn't anticipate.
Yeah.
True.
Yeah,
I think with digital, you could create any of these things, but there's always an element of randomness that you can make the happy accident. You set the stage for the happy accident, but you don't know what will happen.
I think. Do you think humans seek out that experience of surprise in other parts of their life? I mean, spiritually or through the wonder of XYZ kinds of representation. Like where else would you be able to locate that experience?
Wouldn't you say travel would be?
Travel.
Throwing
absolutely.
yourself out of you can set yourself a certain parameter, but the whole goal is to be surprised.
Yeah.
You do the same
Hiking
yoga
at
routine
night with
15
no
Oh,
flashlight.
yeah. You're making life sound very exciting.
Now with the cyanotype, that's a slightly different process than some of these because in some kinds of cyanotype making you can see. Can you see when you're making your cyanotypes?
I can
Do you know what I
see
mean?
that the
What you're
paper is
doing?
being exposed.
Yeah.
I can't control the sun.
No, you cannot.
So
control
if the
it.
sun decides to go behind a cloud or, and I can, I use a stopwatch and I know exactly how long it's there for, but there's no set guide.
Right.
It's always going to be like when I think it's done enough. Unless the wind comes along and determines what the exposure will be.
And is that true of the paper as much as it's true of the rope? Like, so in a lot of these, we see these ropes that are kind of deployed as if, the paper is their parameter, right? Like, you have this object that is in this shape because it has confines of some kind.
It's a heavy watercolor paper because it has to be in a place like the LA River, the Pacific Ocean. I mean, it's like,
It's kind of red feather.
I had to like chase a piece of paper down the LA River once. I thought I'd die like running on that.
What can we sacrifice for the art?
Yes.
Yeah.
Make it a performance.
But even though the paper's heavy, a big wind can just, I mean, a big wind determines what you're going to get, which is why this one has rocks on it. Because there were several ones before it.
Oh, those are weights. Those are paper weights. It's not like there was a tumbling rock. Gotcha.
You know, you go to the natural land. When I did people, I did a big series of, as you know, of people laying on several sheets of paper, and I like the multiple pieces of paper. And I would try to take something from the natural environment to add, because for me, I don't want to change the subject too much because I do love all aspects of this conversation, but a lot of it's about connection to the land. So I want to use something from the land, and I can see, you know, when I try to determine what's best, but the sun and the wind are active components.
Sounds like those are the kind of catalysts of improvisation here. It's the elements that you have the rope, you have the paper, you know the process, but the elements are what's intervening in this case. Yeah, which is land.
I went to New York to make the pictures for that book, and I made all the test prints and had 5 days of sunshine, and I was there for 10 more days, and that sun just stayed behind the clouds. And I was talking to a painter friend, and she's like, "You can make cyanotypes from overcast," and I was like, an artist has to learn to work with what's given to them.
Well, during the pandemic, a lot of intro photo students were home doing cyanotypes because that was available to them.
Right.
When they couldn't go. So it was actually great. You could teach them, hey, you just put a little cumin in, you can get an orange print. It's like, what's in your kitchen? You got some vodka? Let's do it. So yeah, it's really, it's something you can do anywhere at any time.
Yeah. That's something nice too about the whole, like these alternative processes, is that they were done so long ago, and with this spirit of exploration, that it really doesn't matter what you do. You can, I mean, it's just, all it is it's sort of like you're jumping on the path that these guys were on when they were just starting out playing whatever happens to be in the kitchen or the garage or the medicine cabinet.
And you have all the time in the world to pound the dandelions.
Yes.
Marigolds.
But you are not using objects in the photograms that we're seeing, right? In the case of the black and white photograms that are on the wall that have kind of irregular edges, we're seeing the interaction between a rope and a stone, or a horse and a pie plate. What are we seeing?
Well, they are objects. I mean, they were pretty much anything that happened to be in my studio.
Okay.
And I mean, some of it I went after, and I thought, oh, that'd be kind of an interesting thing to bring in, But sometimes it was just like there's a two rabbits and this thing over here, which everybody goes, oh, I love the two rabbits. But it was a piece of paper that was in the studio. It's from a soap shop on the 3rd Street Promenade in Santa Monica, And so it was just all sort of like whatever was there. And I'm in the dark, just kind of like reaching in and putting things here. And then sometimes I would tape
And then
things
you would
down.
do this.
Yeah.
Here, make
It's
this
in it too.
And
Correct.
yeah, so I would just put it, whatever down, however I wanted it to be, and then I would roll it up into this tube. And then I would take, sometimes I would take tape and put it here, or I'd clip it with a clothespin, and those things would repeat. So you're dealing with sort of like this multiple image kind of weird processing.
Right. Because these, in fact, all of these are like still flat to the light. They're experimenting with sequence, and they're experimenting with the elements, but yours involve a decision to kind of upend that flatness.
Yeah.
And so instead of maybe elements, you're handling phenomena and how physical space and
Right.
volume responds to light.
Right, and it was a way just.
What was
oh,
that?
Oh, I just said bending.
Bending,
like,
yeah, and to
bending
invert, you
the
know, it was-
paper.
bending is sort of a word that did come up, is to kind of bend it back upon itself. There was something from, I can't remember what it was now, but from some meditation course taken, that the teacher was talking about bending the mind back upon itself. And so it sort of played into all of that. And then I would take I would take a flashlight and I would expose the whole thing with a flashlight, sometimes on the inside, outside, and hang it up on a substrate with clips. Took a sponge, dipped it into developer, and washed the print into existence.
It's interesting. There in the history of cameraless photography, there are a couple people who I like in between the world wars. Were experimenting with this kind of movement of a negative being a pretty broad term. Like Lottie Jacobi would take like transparency stuff and kind of move it in and out, or Heinrich, what's his name, in Paris would
Oh, right.
really kind of twist and stuff. And I think I think that's like a real perversion of this kind of expectation that the photograph receives the image from the outside world, is that actually the photograph can be an agent. And I think all of this work engages this question of how can the photograph itself be an agent of its own, how does it collaborate with you in different ways? How does it speak back in some ways? So as you guys were talking about like making a show around the idea of what is seen and what is unseen, like how then did all of these different kinds of collaborations that the medium could have with you, how did that feed into that topic? Is that a long-winded question?
No.
Like when we shift from all these really physical processes and like engagements with memory into this question of what we can see, I guess my question would be, how does the body see instead of just the eye? How does how do we see our memory? Like those are questions that your various perversions or and I don't mean that word poorly. I use it with my students all the time, and they think I'm saying bad things, but I'm not. How do these various kind of like playful attitudes towards the medium? How do they suggest other ways of seeing?
There's several different ways I think you can go about creating art. Sometimes you have an ironclad plan and set of rules, and you follow them, and you create exactly what you knew you were going to create in the beginning. And I think sometimes the process leads me, and you do something, and after you analyze it, you then see how much it reflects your core values. Kind of losing my train of thought.
So your practice helps you see, your process helps you see.
No, I think I make it, and then like I can see that, seeing the unseen, trying to see what's behind things, what's implicit in things, is part of your connection to all of Earth. So that work that you can see hanging on the wall is really only evidence of a performance you did somewhere, making something that
I use the word artifact sometimes. Does the word artifact resonate with you? Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's an artifact of an experience, if not a
Right.
performance itself. Yeah.
Can I cut in on
Yes.
that? Because I found this very brief quote by a musician, the Swedish musician Arvo Pärt.
Oh, yes.
Correct me if I'm pronouncing his name wrong. But in his music, and I think this really applies to the visual process that maybe we go through, he says, a need to concentrate on each sound so that every blade of grass would be as important as a flower. So I just thought, wow, I love that. Just sort of the equalizing process of paying attention and why isn't the grass as important in our culture as a flower, or, just kind of making everything
Common
equal.
things, yeah.
Yeah.
So in your work, you
So
would
these
say-
works are evidence of us paying attention to a blade of grass.
Well, that makes sense with what you were saying for sure, as far as like where this pie plate goes and
Mhm.
how, right? I mean, in this one,
Yeah.
it's less important the what of the photograph in this one, the act of searching.
Yeah, I think so. And like, so what really is there any one important image, or is it all important? And if you can put it together in a way in which it creates a more, the parts to the whole, and, creates maybe more of a sense of movement and how we move through life, or dance, or walk, or drive, or, that kind of thing. The sort of speed at which we live, even though this was analog, and also the slowness with which we might study a blade of grass, like Duray studying the weeds. And,
There's a similar emphasis, I think, or rather, kind of pivot of emphasis, I think, in the two things that you guys are up to in your pictures. This juxtaposition act and this like broken sequence or whatever. I mean, is that true?
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing I remember being very excited to work with these three folks because of how what they're describing just now. Over these years of getting to know them, I always felt that we understood each other, and because I would share with others. And sometimes it just felt like there was a little bit of understanding or appreciation, but these three, they seemed to get it. And when we would converse or talk about work that we knew, I felt a real connection.
And you guys have a studio critique group, and that's the history you're referring to.
We used to.
Yeah.
Before.
Yeah.
In the before time.
Before, like ancient times.
BC. It was mostly also just to kind of have a dialogue.
We were
Yeah.
really discussing photographic things, sometimes reading the same materials, sometimes not.
Just sharing work we were developing or things that were on our mind. And so it was just really nice to have people that I could communicate with and share stuff who I felt got it.
And what sounds like one of the things, just to play you back to that question, one of the things you two share, and maybe you all share, but I'm just going to do it between these two kinds of pictures, is this like de-emphasis of a center. Like instead of like noticing Putin, you're going to notice the guard standing next to Putin. He's like tying his shoe, or
What's in the background?
right, right.
So it
Which-
calls into question sort of a hierarchy of,
Yeah.
of images within, or items within or objects within the image itself.
Right.
What's outside the frame?
Correct.
Right.
Right. And I think Alan Watts addresses that so well in so many of his lectures. And I just, decades ago, I copied something that he said, now it's all yellow, it's a real artifact. It says, think of space as anything but nothing. But I also remember in the 80s listening to some of his lectures, and he would talk about watching, let's say, an animal move behind a fence. So you'd have the fence and you'd have the open part, and you'd have the fence and you'd have the open part. And he would say, well, because we know what we see, we know we're not looking at slices of an animal.
Right.
But it was so interesting the way he approached the phenomena of perception and the continuity and how the brain fills in,
Right.
so many, everything,
Yeah.
really.
Right.
So I love
Desires to fill it in.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. I mean,
Seeking.
we want to find that bunny in
Yes.
in the painting.
Right.
But yeah, I when I went to film school, I studied with Trinh T. Minh Ha, who at that time was called an ethnographic filmmaker. I think that term has fallen out of use, but it's more experimental or whatever. But she described, I can't remember where, she was somewhere in foreign place, and taking, movies of people doing a dance, and then you show the movies to the people taking the dance, and they're all going, look, there's a snake in the grass.
Yeah.
Wow.
And how our ways of seeing are different, and it always just made me think of what's outside the frame, what's, like the guard standing next to Putin.
Right.
And I think that we liked, you could have been part of those conversations, because photography is everyone is a photographer today. And there's documentary photography where you're telling a story, and there's, a lot of formal aspects to photography that we all love. Laura
Absolutely.
is very, very formal. Not Laura, I'm
Careless.
sorry. But also embracing the other things as you yourself do in your work. I mean, your photographs of people are about moments in time, and just kind of putting those ideas together instead of like focusing on this formal aspect and not being
Correct.
able to go on another journey.
Mhm.
It was one of the real goals of the surrealists, right? That in the contour drawing, the blind contour drawing, or in any of the word games that come from association, free association, you get out of yourself in some way into some other place. Is that something that you guys also, especially you two, like relate to with this process? This idea of like being able to get away from the logical. Is there anything?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
I'm looking at you.
Yeah. In a way, it's sort of like throw it at the wall and see what sticks, and then, try and do it again.
Yeah.
I have heard it said that is what art is.
Yeah.
I mean, who cares what art is? But I have definitely heard certain people say, art is when you can do it again.
Yeah, but you can do it again, but the results make
It'll
it
be
different.
for sure. But,
Yeah.
but it is creating some sense of a pattern or a system out of an experiment in order to find different variables out of a control set. In some respect.
Right, yeah. I mean, after a while, for me, it was just like walking around in the dark in this hot room,
Mhm.
because I had plastic all over the windows, and small room, big table that I could get up on and rip this mural paper up into, smaller pieces, and, pack that back up, and, so that it doesn't get exposed. And I mean, you're doing all this stuff, and the sweat's pouring off of me, and then I'm like,
That's going to affect finished product.
oh yeah, I mean, it's all like,
Salt water. It's just
Yes.
it's after a while, I felt like, okay, I'm inside the camera. And I'm making the image, literally making the image inside the camera. And it's sort of like something that we had talked about a long time ago, is the whole idea that when you take a picture with the camera, the mirror swings back up so you can't see what you're taking a picture of. And
There's
and
a
so
moment of that.
yeah, and so it's a blind photo. You don't know, you don't get to see that moment. And this was sort of like an exaggeration of that, and to be able to slow it all down and sort of walk through it, and after a while, it was like it really was sort of like a bending of time, like a psychedelic trip, without the after effects. Or at least those after effects. But yeah, it was definitely, it was a way to sort of like step into an altered space, and so that you stop thinking about. I mean, I tried to guide it as much as I could, but there was a point at which I would just have to say, okay, I'm letting go.
Yeah.
And just let whatever
will be.
Yeah, well,
And
whatever.
you learn about yourself. I mean, that's what the surrealist intention was, at least. I mean, sometimes, not always. I mean, because you don't always like have an outcome. It's not like you paid $10 and you come away with like self-knowledge. But I put in the sweat in my hot room, and I
Spiritual
came away
materialism.
but like you do end up somewhere. Right.
In surrealism, though, I also think of the sort of literary aspect of surreal and the imagistic qualities of the shock of, image A plus image B equals image C. And, as in like the overused word now, juxtaposition, which used to be my favorite word. I mean, now it's like,
Yeah.
but you take the two images, you put them together, you create this third thing, and perhaps like poetry in the
Yes.
process. And I always, I studied in college as an undergraduate French symbolist poetry. So I was very interested in how images come together and create the third image, or, like the example I can think of that I always love to show to my students is the Man Ray photograph of, it's just very simple. It's an apple. And instead of the stem, he put in like a screw, and the screw becomes the stem, and it just makes total sense. It's beautiful, and we don't question it. And the two very unrelated things, the apple and the screw, but they create like the third quality.
I mean, one of the things that I've been super interested in, I mean, not to throw my own research into this, but that I've been really obsessed for the last couple of years.
Yeah, please
Been really obsessed the last couple of years with this kind of expansive group of surrealist ladies. And there's this one woman, Ida Karamyan, who was a Russian-Armenian refugee to Iran and then to Egypt. She was really raised in Egypt. And when Lee Miller came over with her surrealist library, they were all hanging out. And Ida started making these photographs that were really like a local notion of how surrealism could affect political agency in a group of people who, didn't really have a sense of where they were from anymore, because they'd all either been, refugees or enslaved or colonized, big political questions. So she starts taking pictures of stuff, sometimes with her husband, and it's like an animal bone or a statue foot or a something. It's not always a photogram, but although she did those, and it starts to just the significance pivots a little bit, and for them it's really political. I mean, I know I started this conversation with the question of whether breaking apart material and this kind of fixed idea of what photography is political for you guys. But I also think that like that tweak of perception and the decision to look outside the conventional subject, or the decision to let go in some ways, it has a history of being political, even when it's not photographing Putin, and so I'll ask now if that sense of the polis of a political move is in the work at all for you guys after my lecture on surrealism. Ida Karamyan is super cool, and like I hope.
Well, it does seem a little bit of a privileged political place to be, like, instead of directly addressing, people's lives being torn apart, it's a little bit political from maybe a more, I don't know, philosophical, behavioral point of view, where the politics is in learning how to perceive and observe. Observation, I think, maybe is political.
I mean, political being a Greek word that means between people, right? So,
Okay.
So it doesn't have to be like Democrat versus Republican, but it doesn't have to do with the way that we interact. Politically is a word all attached to the end.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of radical to go around observing and noticing and pointing out and showing, I guess. I mean, mostly just to be aware of the visual environment, and also it helps you decode some of the messages that are out there that we need to understand, who is saying what to us through what literacy. It's just really political.
Yeah.
Because we're just visual now. I don't know how many people read anymore, people under a certain age. I mean, but visual is so important to be able to comprehend, I think.
To spend that time
Yeah.
to look closely at the mundane or the everyday, or, these ropes, or just to think about water or wind or the back of a photograph, those little, the text on the back of a small, you found those in a thrift store, right?
Actually, the ones that are on here,
Yeah.
it's an album. It's a personal album.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
But
But
just
lots of them I did. Yes.
yeah, the idea of caring about something that would be thrown away or just walked past, taking that time, maybe it is on one level, it's a luxury, like you were just saying, a privilege. But, you know, I'm glad to be in the company of people that do that, and then people that care to listen to us. That's the process.
Forgot there was an audience.
I also think that when we're involved in this this process of making images, and so then you have to sort of like take a step back and say, well, how is an image made? And then you get into, you know,
Right.
you get into a lot. You're up to your
Yes.
knees, your hips, and it by then. And for me, it's like I go back to what was his name? Who's that guy? That philosopher, that French philosopher that wrote that book, The Image, about how the images we see are what we imagine. And so photography seems to, and this kind of like bakes into an idea that I've been working with a long time about a latent image that exists pre-image in our minds, and how the sensory perception of what we're seeing out there, whether we're seeing something that is out there, or we're just being stimulated to make our imaginations create images in our minds. You know, it's like how that in itself is a very political act. You know, what is in your imagination? What can you imagine? But then photography comes along and says, well, you're not imagining it. We're recording something that's out there. So it's this contradiction of these two things that both seem to be true, in a sense.
And it's also, you guys are all insisting in this work, I think, tell me if I'm wrong, on the fact that it's not just an image, that it's a body too. I mean, your work is very much, you know, it's a sequence of heavy paper, you know, and you've got these sequences or patterns, and you've got these little prints that are like sitting on shelves over there or otherwise pinned to the wall. And even these, which are quite flat, are mounted in such a way that they are intentionally objects, right? So is there something about making sure that people understand that photographs are objects with lives in the world that's also political?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, first I want to say that I really can't wait to get home and start researching some of those surrealists.
Yeah.
I need to get those going. I think when I first did photography, it was more about, is the photograph a document of a moment in time, or is like, what is my memory? I realized my memories of Christmas wasn't, as a child, was actually viewing my father's home movies of Christmas. So you confuse, like today, people think of their birthdays, but they're really thinking of when they saw the picture on Facebook. They're not really remembering being in the room. So I was more concerned with photography in those kind of ways, but over time, I think as a result to my place in the world, it has become a lot more, it's absolutely political. It's about land. It's about the way we relate to land. I mean, Jean-Jacques Rousseau in 1760 or something said the first man who put up, I'm paraphrasing, but the first man who put up a fence and declared the land his own. Why were people not outraged and saying, that's a lie, you know, the land belongs to all. And so it's about feeling connected to the land. I mean, I grew up in Central Park, in New York City, like I learned to climb trees in Central Park. I couldn't have been more disconnected from whatever land was. And I make cyanotypes in the desert, and I put the paper behind the alive plant. I don't cut the branch off and put it under grass. It's like, it's a living document. And I don't know why I do it, but I know that if I don't do it, I become desperately unhappy.
Yeah.
And so it kind of validates for me some connection to the land, and it makes me, I wish I could do more to help our earth, but all we can do is actions in our own lives and with the people we come across. So it is political. I always wished my work looked more political.
But I'm just trying to emphasize the fact that I don't think it has to be of, I'm just going to do Putin again. It doesn't have to be of Putin in order for people to make those questions of what is the photograph doing? Is it true? I mean, look, the photograph is always the conversation is always going to come back to truth, right? Like that's always where the photograph begins and ends in people's minds. And even though we know, right, that like it's malleable and you can use Photoshop, you can also do manipulations in the darkroom. Still, if you want to check up on your boyfriend, you're going to go on Instagram and see if like, he was like hanging out with someone, and he'll be like, that's not a true picture, but it still says something to you, right? So everyone actually believes a little bit of what they see if it's a photograph. It's like pigment is to paint. Like it is in whatever you do, like that thing that you made over there that has no representational or referential stuff going on. Still, like we still map onto it your movements,
Oh, sure.
and that's a truth, right? So I think when it becomes physical like that, we have different registers as far as what truth is, and we use our bodies maybe as part of that registry, which is different from just like the scroll, you know.
And also just maybe it becomes more of ritualistic or something.
Yes.
It's like it's being working in photography, whether it's camera or light on paper, has a physical ritual, almost choreographic quality to it. So you're kind of slowing, it's like living in slower time,
Yes.
it seems.
Right.
Like the way you work or the way we all work, you know, just slowing it down and paying attention and
And honestly, I don't know that it's privilege to work on perception, right? Like if you're living in a war-torn moment, I see pictures, you know, of Ukraine's war from journalists, from people who actually live in these places, still pictures of cats, and you know, and they're not like trying to show you all the bad stuff all the time. You can't live constantly in a state of focus on the violence, right? And so, like, you'll see a birthday party happening in Syria while the family is on the run. You have to celebrate your birthday, right? and you know, so I really do think it's actually a deprivation to only focus on the violence. And instead, it's really important for us to focus on perception, so that we learn, as you say, visual literacy. And we learn to question whether the pictures are true or not.
Yeah. Well, that's good. I'm glad.
Good. So you're not too privileged. So is there anything, I don't know how long we've been talking, it's almost an hour. Like, is there anything that you wanted to suss out of the work before maybe we ask some, you know, a question? Was there anything about the question of sight? And I know you guys read an essay together before you put the show together. Was there something about that you wanted to share, the essay that kind of cohered this work for you? I think it'd be nice just to hear.
Yeah.
what
I mean, we kind of like put it in a nutshell earlier, and it's David Abrams wrote this article. I can't remember, what was the article? Do you remember?
Invisibles.
Yeah, The Invisibles, and he considers himself an ecological philosopher. Very interesting moniker there. But he was talking about the invisibility of things, meaning like the microphone, I can't see past the screen on the phone. So whatever is behind or inside of it, not behind it, but inside the microphone is invisible to me. Okay. This wall, I can't see what is on the other side of the wall. So whatever is on the other side of the wall is invisible to me. So that's a second sort of category thing. And the third would be more of a metaphysical, sort of beyond normal perceptions, things that we can't see, things that like our perception of what God is, our perception of what the universe is, our perception of what infinity is, whether we're talking about a space that's expanded into as far as it can go, or cut down into the smallest little bit that keeps being cut in half, and cut in half, and cut in half, which is kind of two things I love about Infinity is that they have a dualism to them. So that was the article kind of in a nutshell. It was a long article, but it was very interesting. And that kind of got us thinking into this space of seeing things that were unseen.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I took a quote when I put it in my book, and David Abrams, I think, describes himself as an ecological anthropologist.
Oh, an anthropologist? Oh, okay.
I could have that wrong,
Uh.
I mean, my memory, but there's a million great quotes in this article. What I chose was the spirits or invisibles spoken of by oral indigenous peoples are not physical beings, but are a way of acknowledging the dimensions of senses that we cannot see at any moment. A way of honoring the manifold invisibilities moving within the visible landscape, and of keeping oneself and one's culture awake to such unseen and ungraspable aspects of the real. They are a way of holding our senses open to what is necessarily obscured from view, a way of staying in felt relation to the unseen waters that sustain us, to the invisible tides in which we're immersed.
That's really cool. I immediately went to Blow Up the Hole, the Blow Up, where the camera sees, it's kind of like the idea of the snake that you were talking about earlier, where the camera, I mean, we can only focus on one thing, but the camera sees everything. It sees, so everything is in the field of the camera, and so that's sort of like the super reality of the photographic process itself, is that it doesn't perceive the same way that we do. Yeah.
Back to that kind of notion of collaboration with your medium, yeah. Felt relations. That's a nice term. Do you guys have any questions for them? That we've just been talking and enjoying each other.
Yeah, I have a question. It's gonna seem like super simple to answer. It's a super stupid question, but like with the body book that you're currently working on, not so much from the past, what's motivating you to start the process?
Yeah, is this current work? Is this like right now work?
No, this
No,
work
okay.
was proposed several years before the pandemic and was set to open
Gotcha.
May, I think, 2020, or May, I think it was, and it got postponed, and here it is now.
And thanks very much to Carolyn for keeping us on board here,
Big time. It has been a pleasure to work with Carolyn
Yeah.
in this physical space and the concrete and the light.
Yeah.
Max is great.
Just amazing. So then what motivated this work? What motivated this work, but then what might be motivating the shift if this is older work?
Well, for me, I think I touched on it a little bit earlier, is this whole idea of a latent image of how we create images. And so I went about like this kind of like, in my way, it's kind of a stupid way of doing it, which is I'm going to make my own image inside the camera, which is fun. It's like being a child. This is the way I'm going to do it. I'm not going to like have some heady idea about it. And so I get caught up in sort of like this idea of how an image comes into existence, and then you get kind of lost in it, which is kind of the beauty of it. It's just like I don't know what's going on,
And that's a sustaining motivation through probably this work into
Oh yeah,
newer work,
absolutely.
yeah.
I mean, it's like in a sense the work keeps going on. It's like I can't stop it. It's like I made these years ago, but it's like the same ideas, the same concepts and everything keep coming back up in my life all the time, and they apply themselves in different ways, not having to do with photography. It may be how I engage in an argument with somebody, to my detriment.
You put stuff up over the windows and you start sweating.
But it's like for me, it's like, it's not something like, oh, I decided I'm going to do this for my art project kind of thing. It's just, it's part of me, I can't stop it. It's kind of.
I think for me, the pandemic, just made several little practices that were different. I'd spend more time gardening in my house and I'd find weeds. So then I started a series of pandemic note cards, which are both about observing like these quiet moments of shelter in place, but also kind of, I've always been concerned with the ritual of the greeting card and other things, what rituals we have in our lives and culturally how they continue or manifest. And also advocacy for the post office. But it was interesting because you pulled grass and it's Bermuda grass, which came from another continent and it has roots, so it's really sustaining. So there's so many things going on. I just make a site type of it, or the roots that they're unwanted roots, but they're roots. Life always there's this aspect of, once I did a series on, Christmas trees after the holiday. It's always like, it's disposable, like everything is kind of disposable. So I did those of like, which, they're weeds, I'm taking them out, but they're roots, which is like, we love the idea of roots, if you're rooted to a place or home. And I did other of the containers food coming, just like, and these aren't under glass, so they're, barely dependent on the time of day and what comes through. And maybe the grapes came in a bag, and maybe it says they came from Peru. And you're saying to yourself, why is food coming from, if it comes from Mexico, it makes some sense, but when it comes halfway around the world. And
so it sounds like you're motivated, but very responsive. You're like, package comes with the Christmas trees outside if you're pulling up the route. Each project or each wave of right? There's a
I suppose in a really simplistic way that like gives meaning to my life. Like
it's what could be more important?
I'm really confused about what's important anymore.
Once I was in Las Vegas and I uprooted a fake flower and it had a whole fake root system.
That's our world.
I was mind blown. Okay. What about you? Has your practice shifted since this work?
No, I'm really excited to keep moving with it because I've got the black and white, and then I'll do it in color. And so that's also, that has, it manifests differently. Because black and white is a little more forgiving in terms of exposure, what's going on with the, the lighting at that moment. And every time I do the exposure for each time, because there's two, I have to subtract. So there's some of that calculation when you're making.
It's actually really hard to do a double exposure in camera successfully and still come away with like discernible tone differences.
Yeah.
Because usually you're like just going to overexpose it.
Yeah, so exactly. So I have to kind of think about all that, and the black and white gives you that latitude to kind of have some error. The color less so, but the color behaves in a different way, and so I kind of like to explore both, depending on where I happen to be, what time of year it is, what time of day it is.
Also, what you're trying to articulate. It's okay if something's like a lot of purple,
Right.
if you're not trying to say this card was red and this card was blue, if you overexposed and the color. But you actually appear to be like really trying to make choices about what you're articulating, even though you are losing control.
Yeah, with the color, if you've got a clear day, ideally, and there's a lot of contrast, and there is some, what I'm seeing, again, going back to perception, what I'm seeing and how that's behaving and how it will end up in the image,
Mhm.
that latent image. You know, and again, this is where I felt a lot of connection to, you know, these folks and how they work, is there's a little bit of all of what they've spoken about. I realized and still think about how it's very same for me. There's in this marking of kind of time, what Meg was just saying about, you know, the Christmas trees, it's these rituals. And, you know, in the work that we create, going back to, again, essays and conversations about how the photograph and what was there will never appear again in the same way. So that memento of that death, that death of that moment, you can never have it be the same. And so there's always that kind of in the back of my mind. This is a unique moment.
Or two.
Yes, correct. Yes, X plus Y, you know.
And with these, maybe you've moved on into or have other threads of practice, but especially given the fact that this is older film that you take into new processes, did that ever motivate more film knowing you would do this? I mean, I think sometimes when we begin a new practice, it influences what, you know, if you could have gone out and shot more 35 and like kept it around.
Right.
What did you do?
I mean, it's a good question, because in a way, these analog color prints were, in a way, I hate to say it because it wasn't the end, but it was a little bit my swan song to working in a color darkroom, which I knew I would lose at some point. So these were like done in, I don't know, 2010-ish. And I just decided, you know, and I have to honestly say, I have become way more digital.
Yes.
I know, but I was mining my image bank of all the negatives I shot from, you know, 1980 something up until early 2000s maybe. And interestingly enough, I just, you know, kept, instead of shooting more 35, I started digging deeper and deeper into my archive of
So
35.
marking of time, right?
Right,
You've got
right.
your evidence of.
Yeah, I'm just trying to find something that was, you know, had a certain amount of lyricism to it, but I also wanted to be about the photographic process, so they're a little bit almost self-referential. And I've kind of, in a way, moved into more digital, you know, image capture. I still work in the same way, but I use a digital image bank instead of an analog image bank, just because for so long we were threatened with the absolute end of analog photographic processes.
Right, no more film.
No more dark rooms.
Right.
I mean, I don't even know if in LA you can do a color.
Probably not.
You know, these were in a rented color dark room that became something else. So I don't even know anymore how.
Yeah, I mean, I do it in pans now in my own darkroom, but
The
but
color.
it's a hot mess. I mean,
Do
yeah,
you
yeah,
do
you
color?
yeah.
Oh my
I didn't
God.
think you could get the chemistry.
Wow.
You can get the chemistry, and
Whoa.
you can get the pans, and you can get the cancer.
Oh, yeah.
It's part of the plan.
Right.
But in any case, like beyond the fact that you can do it,
Yeah.
it also like doesn't though mean, and I think maybe it's important to just begin to like talk about how we are in charge of how much surprise we encounter, whether it's digital or analog. These are not like outside of ourselves forces. It's not like fascism. You know, like, you know, actually you can intervene in both fascism and digital processes. Right? The question is just for those of us who like to use our bodies, how do we engage physically with the digital? Because it's just another thing. You just don't always want to be in front of your computer. So like, how are you going to put that into space and still be able to experience the surprise feeling?
Could you answer that question?
Sorry?
Could you answer that question?
Which part of it? I just say a lot of words and I just do you like them?
How do you put the surprise into digital?
Oh, I think there are a lot of apertures for that. I mean, you know, it depends on which point in the digital you want. Like for example, just even inside Photoshop, there are lots of cool ways to encounter. And my whole show about my year of death with my dad, a lot of what I was doing was all I had of that whole year of his sickness was like iPhone pictures. I wasn't bringing a 4x5 or bringing a piece of photo paper into the hospital and photogramming his ailing. Not going to happen, right? So I had iPhone pictures, and they meant a lot to me, right? This is my favorite person. So I put them in, Photoshop. Sometimes I would just take them, print them out on clear stuff, and take them into the darkroom and throw chemistry on it and try to find them. That's a physical kind of metaphor, making out of the material chemistry that came from a digital source. But at other points in the process, I would bring, put the picture in. And I didn't want to have the whole picture as a negative, where I would Photoshop an image together, and I didn't want that whole thing as a negative. So I would just make a layer kind of like that and use my finger to try to find what was under it. Because in Photoshop, you can use your finger to get through. The layers are physical. They just don't look like it, right? So you can put a lot of layers on top of each other and like carve through it with your finger and find things. So there's places where you can bring it into the dark room.
That's called digital painting. People do that and
I don't know how you guys feel about the word paint, but I think that whenever someone calls a photograph painterly, or whenever they call it digital painting or photographic painting, I think that is like assuming it is an unmanipulable thing, and painting is.
Mhm.
And this is light drawing. The word photograph means light drawing.
Mhm.
So it's actually in our name, and they can go do whatever they're going to do. Like, painting is wonderful, but it is coming from the imagination onto substrate. You take paint and you put it down, whereas with photography, it's always, even if there's a lot of imaginative play involved, it is always like both revealed and given, and it also has a body as well as a face. Like there's a lot of like ins and outs, and you can just push through that with your finger or with a chemical, or so many ways to intervene. So yeah, I resist the word paint, but that's just me. Anyway, so those are two ways that I think it's. Right? Have you guys found some apertures?
Oh,
it's not a
absolutely.
binary, right? Like it's.
Like moving a digital camera at night
Right.
while it's focused on
Right.
something.
Or even the printer itself. Like,
Oh,
again, if you want to talk
absolutely.
about our bodies, like yanking the paper out, you can do whatever you want.
Right, or using a scanner as a camera, or.
Yeah.
Or like running out of ink and still printing.
Yeah.
I have some weird, whatever you would call them.
printing on the wrong side of the paper.
Yeah, and then it dries. Fun, use the wrong kind of printer profile. Whoops.
Yeah.
And again, you're kind of fighting the system.
Exactly.
Or you can actually be working with it sometimes, and to your
Right.
own demise,
Yeah.
you come up with something that
Right.
could shut down your whole
Yes.
computer and everything.
Yeah.
I was trying to make something very small and didn't understand the ramifications of making something smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. And I was trying to make it unrecognizable. And I took a big leap and made it very, very, very small. And it suddenly was like hundreds of megapixels, like hundreds of thousands of megapixels. And I was like, I better cancel this very quickly.
That is funny.
Yeah.
So
I mean, a lot of people will make a cyanotype or a photogram with that kind of digital negative base. But yeah, I mean, I don't know.
I just was curious.
Yeah.
I think
She
part of
had a question.
Oh.
Make moderation really fun.
Yes.
she's a fun person.
Agreed.
Okay, my question, I have my own assumptions, but I don't want to assume. Why the camera? Why the camera? Why the camera to make your art?
Well, I don't use a camera.
So why
photography as opposed to painting or
Yeah.
sculpture or?
Yeah,
For me, it was just my background. It was my entrance into some sort of image making, whether, some people start drawing or painting or making sculptures and whatever. But mine was taking pictures, and at an early age, I befriended somebody on the high school newspaper and got to use the darkroom without having any sort of responsibility for doing anything in there. So for me, it was all experimental. It's fun. That's where it comes from for me.
But, you know, I think I early on had an interest in photography. Like in junior college was like also on the newspaper, and you know, you could get in, you know, you had to, getting access to dark rooms, I'm old back then, it was a very informal process. And
But
you
it
know,
was
once
intimidating, though.
once you had it, well, you know, you could.
You had to like know what you were doing.
No, I mean, I think like all life, the more you do something, the better it gets, the more you study it. I mean, it depends on what your personal goals are. I was really interested in films and storytelling. And then, you know, I just had something traumatic happen in my life. And for some reason, I picked up a camera and started taking pictures. And it just was a way for me to kind of anchor myself. And then I began examining what an image is and seeing that my memories weren't memories of actual events, but of viewing the photos of the events. And it's quite a startling experience when you realize how your memories are, you know, like memories of watching the movie, not actually memories of being in the place. And you watch these, you know, like my dad took 16mm movies and we watched them over and over and over. You know, it's like, you know, and I remember Christmas morning because I saw it in those movies, you know. And you just keep exploring, and the more you're curious, it's like a process opens, and every work you do may not be so great, but it may just be a stepping stone to your next body of work. And I think art making is like that, whether it's sculpture or painting or performance or anything. You know, it's like saying, why do you choose? I mean, today everyone's a photographer, right? You take pictures.
Everyone's a writer too, in a way, right? Or a filmmaker. Did you say you went to film school first?
No,
You did.
Which is interesting when you say writer, because we're going back to the etymology. The actual word photograph is not painting with light, but to write.
That's right. That's
To
right.
graph,
It's not like
graphene
drawing. It's
of
like
light, yeah.
Yes, yes.
So and that kind of relates back to imagery in the poetic sense, the rare sense of how we create imagery through words.
But, and also just in answer
Yeah.
to your question,
you
why
didn't
what?
answer why.
Yeah, no, I'm jumping at that bit. Because I mean, why the camera? I was thinking, okay, the camera, because first of all, it's a shortcut. It's fast. It's inquisitive. And if you don't have patience, it gets you there quickly, and it's this trippy machine.
Yep.
And also, it's a little bit occult. I mean, when I was a kid, I just was headlong fascinated by the so-called occult. And it seems like photography just had that crazy
Element.
darkness of the occult, or the magic, the sixth sense.
Do you mean because the image kind of appears?
Yeah, right. And also, I think there's this great book. You might know it. Do you know the writer Michel Tournier? There's a book called The Ogre, and it's set in World War II, where the ogre is this photographer who's escaping the Nazis, and he has his camera, and he really has this bizarre, interesting relationship with his camera, and he calls it like this. He's the ogre. He sees these beautiful children and he photographs them, and in that way he feels like he's stealing the children. He's possessing them. I mean, it's perverted, but it's a really great book, The Ogre. And it's all about photography and the acquisition of, like the myth of stealing somebody's soul by taking a picture, and maybe not completely mythical. I mean, it is kind of a theft, or it's an invasion. And I think as a shy kid, I was always very, very, I could approach people with a camera, whereas I could not approach them for a normal conversation.
Right.
You know, until years later. So something about the camera was like the shortcut to getting something, which seems kind of nefarious.
It's interesting, but it's interesting that you bring up also that it was expeditious.
Yeah, really fast.
And I think that I can totally relate to that because I used to like to draw as a child. But it just, I guess it's human nature, my particular tendency, I wanted it to be very precise and perfect. So every time I would look at it, my drawing, it would be okay, but it always fell short. So it was like realism, I valued high realism, and it seemed like a camera, a photograph. I remember going to see an exhibition of Ansel Adams' work and Weston. And it was that bell pepper, you know, the bell pepper. And it was like, that's such an amazing, I remember looking at that, it was maybe, I don't know, 8 or something. And I was like, I want to do that. That looks so beautiful, the way it represented, and it was soft and the lighting. And I was just like, I want to do this. And I remember my parents got me a little Instamatic. And I remember trying to photograph, we went up to Angela's Crest and I had my Instamatic and I like arranged the pine cone. I'm going to photo, and I got these prints back and I'm like, this is so bad. This doesn't look like the bell pepper at all. You know, so that started that journey of like, it's, you know, here we go, you know, and then of course the darkroom and the box of the camera and loading it, all the rigor. I think something about all of that, you know, stages of making it happen, it just appealed to me. So once you're once you've been seduced, I think, by the film and camera, it sort of just, you know, you latch on, you become connected. So, yeah.
Thank you so much. I think you answered my question, but my question was, how does photography impact the experience of taking picture of the experience that you've been experiencing?
Could you,
Like for me, taking picture makes that moment forever, limitless. It just holds that moment for me. I had losses when I was a kid, and it's like, for me, taking pictures just holds everything immortal for that moment. How does it impact, like photography, how does it impact the experience when you look at the flower or like river, water, grass, roots, when you take a picture of it, how does it impact your experience? Like, does it?
You connect. It feels like you, at least for me, I feel like I'm really looking and consciously, like these locations, I did very intentionally seek them out usually from driving, of course, because we drive everywhere. So, you know, it's like I'm driving, it's like, oh, that's cool. I'm going to go back. So, you know, you create that intention to go to that place. And then, you know, to recall that, like the memory, I think is a big, you know, part of it.
Yeah, I think just to the, you know, there's a fear kind of involved in it too. It's like, oh, I might forget this, you know,
Right.
I might forget this moment, get my
Oh, it's
iPhone out, you know, my son is
Yeah.
taking like his first steps, you know, it's like, I'm going to forget it. It's like but in a way, it has a way of disconnecting us from the moment as
moment.
well.
Yes.
I mean, so I mean, it keeps coming up in this conversation for me is like this sort of duality about what photography we think it does and what
Well,
it
absence
does.
and presence, right? Because like that bridge doesn't exist anymore. They tore
Yeah.
down, or certain things get erased. They
Yeah.
get,
Or
you
if
know?
you look at like old, you know, I look at old snapshots.
Yeah.
People are gone, you know.
the
It's
child
just-
grows up, you know. So like you were saying, it helps you sort of reconnect. And I think memory is, you know, humans.
But at the
way
same
we can
time,
remember things.
At the same time, the way that we do connect to a photograph, as opposed to a painting, we don't, you know, we say that's a painting of Farah, you know, but we look at a photograph of Farah and we go, that's Farah, you know. So we look at this bridge and go, oh, that's that bridge.
Right.
We don't say that's a photograph of this bridge that is long time gone, you know, or
But
whatever
people
the
used
sense
to
of
use
it might
painting
be.
as proof.
Yeah, I mean,
And it's interesting that there's a Walter Benjamin essay about how you wouldn't use a watercolor in a court, in a trial. This guy took my wallet, here's a watercolor. And he talks about, fossil or photograph kind of thing. But certainly a generation before, they did use a
Mhm.
watercolor in court, and we still have court draftsmen, right?
Right,
So
yeah.
this question of proof and memory
mhm.
is not divorced from other mediums. We still trust the words of the journalist, even though it's just coming through a mouth.
Mhm.
But I think we remember our process too.
Mhm.
You know, we all can recall certain things about when we were photographing and, the struggle, like what he was saying, developing it, setting things up, dealing with the wind and the water. We remember getting into the outcome and the process, so.
But
I just wanted to know what your experience was.
Yeah, thank you.
yeah, and sometimes we use that kind of memory to create something that is not necessarily what happened. It's like, I want to forget that,
Yeah.
I don't want it to,
Go
I
away.
don't want to keep that memory, but I took a picture of it, and now I sort of like ascribe my own sort of memory to the memory of it, and it changes everything, I had a great childhood. Everything was handed to me on a silver plate.
I definitely think that I look at pictures in two ways. There's some pictures, there's a picture I have hanging in my house, and it's a long time ago, me and my sister riding a moped in Block Island. But it's really a picture of the person who took, for me, the picture. It's like, oh, that's a picture of Lisa, because she took that picture at that time. And I think sometimes when I look at the pictures I have taken, and the process has changed, in film, you used to just be very focused on the subject, and now the motion is take a picture, look at it. Take a picture, look at it. Take a picture, where before you were just in focus with your subject, But I've always really wanted to just put them in a drawer and look at them 2 years later, really digital or negative, because I think I get more space away from remembering me taking the picture. And then that has like some emotional or feelings that sometimes are in conflict with what's in the picture. So, and my God, we're inundated with images.
Yeah.
It's like sometimes you just want to break.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, my feeling, I've been trying to challenge myself to, because I think, taking that up with a cell phone as a camera, the problem now is when to not take a photograph. So I'm trying to discipline myself to take fewer images because I'm drowning in images. And as much as I love photographing things that are interesting to photograph, I'm also sort of trying to experiment with what does it feel like to not photograph something that I think needs to, I need to get this photograph, but I'm like, wait a minute, how am I influencing my experience by having to always get out this darn piece of technology? It kind of, in a way,
You just want to see it.
Yeah, or you just want to challenge yourself to just
Yeah.
experience without the documentation and wonder well, what am I leaving to the next generation to deal with? Way too much. Or it'll just all go into a big garbage, cyber garbage can. I don't know. So it's kind of scary, to think about the number of images we've generated and where are they and where are they going to go?
Yeah, well, also you can just think about what that mechanical thing is doing to your mind in the way that you remember things. So it's sort of like it starts to form our own memory of things. Do you want a machine to form your memory, or would you like to just do it yourself? I mean, both may be completely inaccurate, and in my opinion, I think they are inaccurate to what what happened, what we experienced. I mean, part of what we experience is, whether we experience it through a machine or we experience it through just life contact with other people. It's I don't know. There's not one way. It's all a way that we experience all kinds of different things.
I used to say something like, yeah, I prefer the flawed aspects of memory or something.
Right.
But that said, it can be very convenient to have an obstacle to place between you and the world. And make you feel a little bit safe, behind that camera, you're like, it's like everything's mediated and you could, and when I had worked as a photographer, it's funny, I could sometimes take pictures of a lecture and I couldn't tell you a word of what the person said. Like I'm behind that camera and I'm unconscious. It's like just me see. I think that was more with you felt that more with a viewfinder you put to your eye than you do with the iPhone.
Oh, definitely.
I think I think it probably take me another 10 years to really figure out how I feel about, and it, one time it was like this and now it's like this and, it's.
I think this is actually, it's like a 4x5 or a 2 1/4. It's really not an obstacle in terms of relations. I mean, it's like, yeah, people should use it less or whatever and really experience things, but like I can really hang out with my nephew with this and like not like
you
lose
can still
eye contact.
see
'Cause
them.
I can still hang out with him.
Because
like,
you don't
play.
have
Yeah.
to look through it as much as you
Yeah.
had to. That's true.
I don't tell him to stop, or just he's doing stuff and I'm like doing this. But I didn't have any pictures of my life from 20 to 35 because I was making art with photos and I forgot that I needed to take pictures of my life. And I'm actually sorry. I'm not sorry. I don't regret it, but like, it's actually really, I definitely take pictures of my mother now. And I'm not, unapologetically, I experience her a lot. And and you do have to be conscious of your relations and quantity and everything. But yeah, I forgot that is a function of the photograph to remember things. I don't have any pictures of anyone I dated. I don't remember. I have to remember what they look like. Maybe that's good.
Right.
But there's a fine line there between being like, oh, this is my medium, and this is my, this is my tool for just memory. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Well, you
Thank
made good enough work. But it's
Just justifies the means. Okay. Okay.
and someday maybe those pictures other people took of you will
Maybe they
surface.
took some of the pic, maybe they have. Okay, we'll
They
see.
will surface. Somebody will post something on Facebook from you like.
Demand money.
Any more questions from anybody? We've been together for a bit now.
I think just the camera and photography is such a fascinating world on so many different levels and philosophically as well, so many different issues and used for so many different parts of aspects of life and perspectives of life. And what always comes to mind, I watched this, I watched the movie, but then I also knew about Kevin Carter, I think it was, and what was it, the photograph he took of the vulture and the little child.
Oh, yeah. Yes.
So, it's like when you said you get disconnected with life when you're behind the camera, it's, sometimes that happens.
So anyways, very fascinating conversation. I really think this could go on for hours. There's so much to talk about. But yes, thank you so much.
Thanks for
Thank you. Thank you.